The sun was setting over Pine Ridge Avenue, casting long shadows across the tree-lined street where million-dollar homes stood like silent sentinels. Officer James Mitchell drummed his fingers on the steering wheel of his patrol car, his eyes scanning the road for anything out of place. He'd been on duty since noon, and so far the day had been uneventful, just the way most officers preferred it, though Mitchell sometimes found himself wishing for a little excitement. His wish seemed to materialize when a sleek black BMW glided past. Mitchell narrowed his eyes, watching as the car moved through the neighborhood at a perfectly reasonable speed. There was nothing obviously wrong with the driver's behavior, but something about the expensive car in this wealthy, predominantly white neighborhood made Mitchell sit up straighter. "Let's see what we've got here," he muttered to himself, flipping on his lights and pulling out to follow the BMW. The luxury car responded immediately, signaling properly before pulling to the curb. Mitchell called in the stop to dispatch, giving his location and the vehicle description before stepping out of his cruiser. His hand instinctively rested near his holster as he approached, a habit formed over his 8 years on the force. Inside the BMW, Robert Henderson took a deep breath and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they would be visible. At 53 years old, Henderson had been through this routine before. Too many times, if he was being honest with himself. He lowered the window and waited, his heartbeat quickening despite his outward calm. "Good evening, sir," Mitchell said, his voice carrying that official tone police officers perfect over years of traffic stops. "Do you know why I pulled you over today?" Henderson kept his expression neutral. "No, officer, I don't. Was I speeding?" Mitchell's eyes scanned the interior of the car, taking in the leather seats, the expensive watch on Henderson's wrist, the tailored suit that probably cost more than Mitchell made in 2 weeks. "Your right taillight is out," Mitchell said, though it wasn't. "License and registration, please." Henderson nodded slowly. "My registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for it now, and my license is in my jacket pocket. Is that all right?" "Go ahead," Mitchell said, watching Henderson's every move with suspicious eyes. A couple walking their dog slowed their pace, watching the scene unfold. The woman whispered something to her partner, who shook his head in response. They weren't the only ones. A teenage boy on a bicycle had stopped completely, pretending to check his phone while stealing glances at the traffic stop. Henderson handed over his documents with a steady hand. "Here you go, officer." Mitchell took them, studying the license with increasing confusion. The address listed was in this very neighborhood, one of those massive houses with the perfectly manicured lawns and 3-car garages. He looked from the license to Henderson and back again. "This your current address?" Mitchell asked, his tone making it clear he had his doubts. "Yes, for about 12 years now," Henderson replied evenly. Mitchell nodded slowly. "And this is your vehicle?" "Yes, it is. Pretty nice car." Henderson didn't respond to the comment, simply waiting for the next question. He'd been here before, too. "What do you do for a living, Mr. Henderson?" Mitchell asked, emphasis on the Mr., as if testing the name for authenticity. "I'm in the legal profession," Henderson answered, deliberately vague. Experience had taught him that sometimes less information was better, until he could assess the situation. Mitchell's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Legal profession? Like a lawyer?" "Something like that," Henderson said. More people had gathered now. A woman walking home from the corner market had stopped. 2 men who had been chatting in a front yard across the street were now watching openly. Someone had taken out a phone, though whether they were recording or simply texting was unclear. Mitchell seemed to notice the growing audience too. He straightened his shoulders, his voice taking on an edge. "Step out of the vehicle, please." Henderson's calm facade cracked just slightly. "May I ask why, officer?" "I haven't done anything wrong." "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle," Mitchell repeated, his hand now resting more firmly on his holster. Henderson closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with renewed resolve. "Officer, I'd like to know what I'm being accused of. I've provided my license and registration as requested." Mitchell leaned in closer. "Listen, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. This car seems a bit too nice for—" He caught himself before finishing the thought. "There have been reports of stolen vehicles in the area. Just step out so we can clear this up." "Reports of stolen BMWs in Pine Ridge?" Henderson asked, knowing full well there had been no such reports. This neighborhood had one of the lowest crime rates in the city. The crowd had grown to about 8 people now, Someone was definitely recording. Henderson could feel his pulse in his throat. The familiar mixture of fear, anger, and humiliation washing over him. 25 years of professional success, a house in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the city. And still this. "I'm going to ask one more time," Mitchell said, his patience visibly thinning. "Step out of the vehicle." Henderson weighed his options. He knew his rights, but he also knew how quickly these situations could escalate. He'd spent his entire adult life navigating these dangerous waters, knowing when to assert himself and when compliance was the safer choice. "I'm going to step out, officer," Henderson said clearly, making sure his words would be heard by any recording devices. "But I want to state that I believe this stop is unwarranted and potentially unlawful." As Henderson unbuckled his seatbelt, Mitchell took a step back, his hand still near his weapon. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Officer Mitchell," a voice called out from across the street. "Everything okay here?" Henderson recognized the voice immediately. Dave Thompson, his neighbor for the past decade, a retired firefighter who spent most days working on classic cars in his garage. Mitchell turned briefly toward the voice. "Everything's fine, sir. Please step back." Thompson didn't move. "That's Robert Henderson, my neighbor." "Is there a problem?" Mitchell's jaw tightened. He turned back to Henderson, who was now standing beside the BMW, his expression a carefully maintained mask of dignity despite the humiliation of the moment. "Your neighbor, huh?" Mitchell said, doubt evident in his voice. "For 12 years, Henderson confirmed quietly. Mitchell looked uncomfortable now, aware of the growing audience and the man across the street who seemed ready to intervene. He glanced down at Henderson's license again, then at the registration. "There've been reports," he began again, but with less conviction. "No, there haven't," Henderson said, his voice low but firm. "Officer, I believe we both know what this is about, and it has nothing to do with my taillight or stolen cars." A police cruiser turned onto the street, Mitchell's backup arriving. Henderson felt his stomach tighten. More officers often meant more complications, more chances for things to go wrong. The second patrol car pulled up behind Mitchell's, and a female officer stepped out. Officer Lisa Chen had 3 years on the force and had worked with Mitchell before. She approached cautiously, reading the tension in the scene. "Everything all right, Mitchell?" she asked, eyes moving between her colleague and Henderson. "Just a routine traffic stop," Mitchell replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. Chen nodded, taking in Henderson's expensive suit, the luxury car, and the gathering neighbors. Her eyes lingered on Thompson, who still stood with arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. "Mr. Henderson says he lives in the neighborhood," Mitchell explained to Chen. "I was just verifying that." "I can verify it," Thompson called out, "and so can about 5 other neighbors here. Robert's lived down the block from me for years." Mitchell's face flushed. He looked down at Henderson's license and registration again, clearly trying to find a reason to justify the stop. Henderson watched him struggle, feeling the familiar mixture of emotions, the anger at being profiled, the relief that neighbors were witnessing it, the exhaustion of dealing with it again and again throughout his life. "Is there anything else, officer?" Henderson asked quietly. Mitchell handed back the license and registration, his movements stiff. "Your taillight," he began, but Henderson cut him off. "My taillights are working perfectly. I had them checked just last week during routine maintenance." The statement hung in the air between them. Mitchell knew he was caught in a lie, and Henderson knew it too. So did everyone watching. "Consider this a warning then," Mitchell said, attempting to save face. "Make sure all your vehicle's equipment stays in working order." Henderson took his documents, careful to keep his movements slow and deliberate. "Of course, officer." "Is that all?" Before Mitchell could answer, Henderson's phone rang. He glanced at Mitchell, silently asking permission to answer it. Mitchell nodded curtly, already turning away to head back to his cruiser, eager to end the increasingly uncomfortable encounter. Henderson answered the call, his voice shifting into a different register, confident, authoritative. "Judge Henderson speaking." Mitchell froze mid-step, turning back slowly as the word judge hung in the air like a thunderclap. The small crowd of neighbors exchanged glances. Thompson smiled slightly from across the street. Henderson continued his phone conversation, speaking clearly enough that his words carried. "Yes, I'll be presiding over that case tomorrow morning. The briefings are on my desk." A pause. "No, I'll be there shortly." Just dealing with a minor traffic issue. Officer Chen's eyes widened as she looked from Henderson to Mitchell. Mitchell's face had drained of color as the reality of the situation dawned on him. He hadn't just racially profiled a black man in an expensive car. He had racially profiled a federal judge. Officer Mitchell stood frozen in place, the word judge echoing in his mind. The confident way Henderson had answered his phone. That wasn't the voice of someone pretending. That was authority, earned and wielded with the casual ease of long practice. But Mitchell's pride wouldn't let him back down completely. Not in front of his colleague, not in front of this growing crowd of onlookers. He waited for Henderson to finish his call before stepping forward again, his posture slightly less certain than before. "Judge?" Mitchell said, attempting to keep his tone neutral. "You didn't mention that earlier." Henderson slipped his phone back into his pocket. "You didn't ask about my specific occupation, officer. You asked what I do for a living, and I said I'm in the legal profession. That wasn't misleading." Officer Chen shifted uncomfortably beside Mitchell. She seemed to sense the ground shifting beneath them. What had started as a routine traffic stop, or what Mitchell had claimed was routine, was quickly becoming something else entirely. Still, Mitchell pressed on, doubling down despite the warning bells now clanging in his head. "It's a bit unusual, don't you think? A judge driving around this neighborhood at this hour?" Henderson's expression remained composed, but something flickered in his eyes. A flash of anger quickly controlled. "Officer Mitchell, I live in this neighborhood, as my license clearly shows and as my neighbor has confirmed. It's barely 7 in the evening and I'm driving home from work. What exactly do you find unusual about that?" The question hung in the air, demanding an answer that Mitchell couldn't give without revealing his own biases. The growing crowd of neighbors seemed to lean in collectively, waiting for his response. "We've had reports," Mitchell began again, but Henderson cut him off. "You mentioned these supposed reports earlier. Reports of stolen vehicles? In Pine Ridge?" Henderson gestured around at the upscale neighborhood. "I've lived here for 12 years, Officer Mitchell. I serve on the Neighborhood Association Board. We haven't had a car theft in Pine Ridge in over 3 years." Thompson, still watching from across the street, called out again. "He's right, Mitchell. You know that. Monthly crime reports go to every officer assigned to this district." Mitchell's face flushed deeper. He glanced at Officer Chen, hoping for backup, but found her studiously examining the ground. She wanted no part of whatever was happening here. "Look," Mitchell said, lowering his voice and stepping closer to Henderson. "Let's not make this a bigger deal than it needs to be. I'm just doing my job." "And what job is that exactly?" Henderson asked quietly, making sure his words wouldn't carry to the onlookers. "Pulling over black men in expensive cars because they look out of place to you?" Mitchell's jaw tightened. "I didn't say anything about—" "You didn't have to," Henderson interrupted. "This isn't my first traffic stop for a broken taillight that isn't actually broken." He paused, looking Mitchell directly in the eye. "But it is the first time it's happened in front of my own neighbors." The crowd had grown to about 15 people now. Someone had brought out a phone and was quite openly recording. Several others had followed suit. Mitchell was becoming increasingly aware that this encounter was likely to live forever online. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some additional identification," Mitchell said loudly enough for the onlookers to hear, trying to regain control of the situation. "On what grounds?" Henderson asked, his voice equally clear. "Standard procedure when there's a question about the vehicle ownership." Henderson's eyebrow raised slightly. "There is no question about my vehicle ownership. You have my registration, which matches my license, which shows I live 2 blocks from here. What exactly are you suggesting, officer?" Mitchell lowered his voice again. "Look, you're making this difficult. I'm just trying to do my job." "Your job," Henderson repeated, not bothering to lower his own voice. "Is your job to fabricate reasons to stop citizens who haven't broken any laws? Is your job to create phantom traffic violations? Is your job to imply that I stole my own car?" Officer Chen finally stepped forward. "Mitchell, I think we're good here. The registration checks out. Mr. Henderson, Judge Henderson, has provided the necessary documentation." But Mitchell wasn't ready to let it go. His pride was wounded, and now there was an audience. Backing down completely would be admitting he was wrong, admitting something worse. "Perhaps. I still need to run the plates," he insisted, even though that was something he could have done from his cruiser before ever approaching the vehicle. "Then run them." Henderson said evenly, but I will not be providing any additional identification beyond what is legally required for a traffic stop. And to be perfectly clear, officer, there was never anything wrong with my taillight. A third vehicle pulled up to the scene, not a police cruiser, but a silver Audi. A white woman in her 50s stepped out, her expression concerned as she took in the scene. Henderson's shoulders relaxed slightly at the sight of her. "Robert?" she called, walking briskly toward them. "What's going on?" "Evening, Catherine," Henderson replied, his tone warmer than it had been moments before. "Just a misunderstanding with Officer Mitchell here. Catherine Williams, Henderson's colleague on the federal bench for nearly 8 years, looked from Henderson to the officers with undisguised suspicion. She was known for her direct approach both in and out of the courtroom. "A misunderstanding about what?" she asked, coming to stand beside Henderson. Mitchell's discomfort visibly increased. One judge was bad enough. Now there were two. "The officer believed my taillight was out," Henderson explained, a hint of irony in his voice. "Then he seemed to have concerns about whether this was actually my vehicle." Catherine's eyebrows shot up. "Your car? The one you've driven to work every day for the past 3 years?" "The very same," Henderson confirmed. Catherine turned her attention fully to Mitchell. "Officer, I'm Judge Catherine Williams, United States District Court. I was on my way to Robert's house to pick up some case files when I saw this gathering. Is there an actual problem here that requires police attention?" Mitchell swallowed hard. "Ma'am, Your Honor, we received reports of—" "There were no reports," Henderson interrupted quietly. Officer Chen stepped forward again. "Ma'am, I believe we've resolved the issue." Judge Henderson provided his license and registration as requested. "We'll be on our way now." But Mitchell wasn't quite finished. His career flashing before his eyes, he made one last desperate attempt to justify the stop. "The vehicle matches a description." "No, it doesn't," Henderson said firmly, his patience finally wearing thin. "Officer Mitchell, let's be honest with each other and everyone watching. You saw a black man driving an expensive car in an upscale neighborhood, and you decided something didn't add up. You invented a broken taillight as an excuse to pull me over. When that didn't lead where you wanted it to go, you implied I might have stolen the car. Now you're trying to save face by inventing reports and vehicle descriptions that don't exist." The gathered neighbors murmured among themselves. The teenager who had been recording everything looked to his friend and whispered something. Thompson, still watching from across the street, shook his head in disgust. Mitchell's face had gone from red to pale. "Sir, That's enough, Mitchell," Chen said, no longer bothering with professional courtesy. "We're done here." She turned to Henderson and Williams. "Judges, I apologize for the inconvenience." "You're free to go." "Free to go," Catherine repeated incredulously. He was always free to go. He did nothing wrong. Mitchell took a step back, finally recognizing the gravity of his situation. A racial profiling complaint from an ordinary citizen was bad enough. A complaint from a federal judge, backed up by another federal judge, multiple witnesses, and video evidence, could end his career. "I apologize if there was any misunderstanding," Mitchell said stiffly. "Misunderstanding," Henderson repeated, the word heavy with meaning. "Is that what we're calling it?" Catherine placed a hand gently on Henderson's arm. The touch seemed to ground him, remind him of something important. He took a deep breath, considering his next move carefully. The crowd waited. The officers waited. Even the evening itself seemed to pause, the usual suburban sounds muted as everyone held their breath to see what would happen next. Henderson glanced at the faces watching them, his neighbors, people who had lived alongside him for years but who perhaps had never truly understood what it meant to be him. Then he looked at the young officer whose career hung in the balance of whatever Henderson decided to do next. "Officer Mitchell," Henderson finally said, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air, "I believe we have an opportunity here. An opportunity to learn, to grow, to do better. I don't want your badge. I don't want your career." Mitchell's relief was visible but short-lived. "What I want," Henderson continued, "is accountability. I want recognition of what just happened here, and I want to make sure it doesn't happen to someone else who might not have the protection of a judicial title." He reached slowly into his jacket pocket and removed a small leather case. He opened it deliberately, revealing the federal judicial badge that had been with him for over 20 years. The gold eagle gleamed in the fading evening light. "You see, Officer Mitchell, this badge means I took an oath to uphold justice and equal protection under the law. But long before I had this badge, I was just another black man being pulled over for broken taillights that weren't broken." Mitchell stared at the badge, the reality of his situation sinking in fully. "So," Henderson continued, "we have a decision to make. Where do we go from here?" The judicial badge caught the last rays of sunlight as Henderson held it, creating a small golden flash that seemed to punctuate the moment. The crowd had fallen completely silent. Even the birds seemed to have paused their evening songs. Officer Mitchell stared at the badge, his mind racing through the implications. This wasn't just any judge. The federal judicial badge meant Henderson presided over federal cases. Cases that could involve police officers. Cases that could shape policy. Cases that made headlines. Mitchell began, then stopped, unsure what to say in the face of such clear evidence of his misjudgment. Officer Chen stepped forward, her expression serious but her voice steady. "Judge Henderson, on behalf of the department, I apologize for this incident. I assure you this isn't representative of our training or values." Henderson nodded slightly in acknowledgement, but kept his eyes on Mitchell. He was waiting for something specific, not from Chen, who had at least tried to de-escalate the situation, but from the man who had initiated it. "Judge," Catherine said quietly at Henderson's side, "do you want me to call the chief? He should know about this immediately." Henderson considered for a moment, then shook his head. "Not yet. I think Officer Mitchell and I need to finish our conversation first." The growing crowd shifted restlessly. Most had their phones out now, recording every word, every expression. A woman near the back was typing rapidly on her phone, likely sharing the unfolding drama on social media in real time. Within minutes, what had started as a neighborhood incident would begin spreading across the internet. "You said we have a decision to make," Mitchell finally managed, his voice lacking its earlier authority. "What exactly did you have in mind, sir?" Henderson studied the young officer's face. Behind the defensiveness and fear, he could see confusion, and perhaps, just perhaps, the first flickers of understanding. "Walk with me," Henderson said, gesturing away from the crowd. "Just a few steps." Mitchell hesitated, glancing at Officer Chen, who gave him a small nod. He followed Henderson a short distance from the onlookers, not far enough to be out of sight, but just enough to have a measure of privacy in their conversation. "How long have you been on the force, Mitchell?" Henderson asked once they were relatively alone. 8 years, sir. And in those 8 years, how many traffic stops have you made for broken taillights that weren't actually broken?" Mitchell's eyes dropped to the ground. He didn't answer, which was answer enough. "I'm not asking to shame you," Henderson continued, his voice low and measured. "I'm asking because I want you to really think about it. I want you to consider the patterns in your work, the decisions you make in a split second without fully examining why you're making them." "Sir, I've been pulled over 27 times in my life," Henderson interrupted. 27 times, Officer Mitchell. The first time I was 17 years old, driving my mother's old station wagon to pick up my little brother from basketball practice. The officer said I had a broken taillight. I didn't. Mitchell looked up, meeting Henderson's gaze. The most recent time was 6 months ago, driving this same car about 5 miles from here, again supposedly for a broken taillight. I've also been stopped for suspicious driving, matching a description, and once, memorably, for looking lost in a nice neighborhood. That was the day I closed on my house here in Pine Ridge, 12 years ago. Henderson paused, letting the words sink in. Do you see the pattern, Officer Mitchell? Mitchell swallowed hard. Yes, sir. And do you understand why what happened today matters? Not just to me, but to everyone watching? To the community you're sworn to protect and serve? I think so, Mitchell said quietly. I don't think you do. Not fully. Not yet, Henderson replied. No anger in his voice, just a deep weariness. But I hope today might be the beginning of that understanding. Back by the cars, Catherine was having a quiet but intense conversation with Officer Chen. The neighbors had begun talking among themselves, many still recording, others on their phones sharing what they were witnessing. I've known Robert for 15 years, one older woman was telling her neighbor. 15 years and I had no idea. I mean, he mentioned some experiences, but seeing it happen right in front of us, that Mitchell has always been trouble, Thompson said to anyone who would listen. Too aggressive, too quick to assume the worst. I've complained about him twice before. The teenager who had been recording everything spotted his father in the crowd and waved him over, showing him the footage with a serious expression that made him look older than his years. Henderson noticed the conversations, the spreading awareness. This moment was becoming something larger than a simple traffic stop gone wrong. It was becoming a window through which his neighbors, mostly white, mostly sheltered from these experiences, could glimpse a reality they'd previously only heard about secondhand, if at all. He turned back to Mitchell. "I said earlier that I don't want your badge. I meant that. What I want is something harder. Sir, I want you to learn from this. Really learn, not just go through the motions of whatever sensitivity training the department mandates. I want you to examine your assumptions, your instincts, and ask yourself where they come from and whether they truly serve justice." Mitchell nodded slowly, the defensiveness in his posture gradually giving way to something that might, with time and reflection, become genuine remorse. "And I want you to understand that not everyone you stop has the protection of a title, the benefit of neighbors who know them, or the privilege of a badge that makes officers think twice. Some people are just trying to get home safely, and your assumptions put that basic right at risk." From the edge of the gathering, a new voice called out, "Judge Henderson, is everything okay?" Henderson turned to see Police Captain Thomas Reeves approaching quickly, his expression concerned. Someone in the crowd must have called him directly. "Captain," Henderson acknowledged with a nod. "We were just having a conversation about community policing." Reeves took in the scene, the two patrol cars, the officers, the growing crowd of neighbors with phones raised, and Henderson standing with his judicial badge still visible in his hand. His expression shifted from concern to something more complicated, part professional calculation, part personal dismay. "Judge, I'd like to apologize for any inconvenience or distress this situation may have caused," Reeves said formally, his eyes flicking briefly to Mitchell with a look that promised a less pleasant conversation later. "Thank you, Captain," Henderson replied, "but I think what we need goes beyond apologies." Catherine stepped forward, her judge's demeanor in full effect. "Captain Reeves, as I understand it, one of your officers pulled over Judge Henderson without cause, implied he had stolen his own vehicle, and attempted to escalate the situation despite clear evidence that no violation had occurred." Reeves winced slightly. "Yes, Your Honor, I've been briefed on the basics. Rest assured we take these matters very seriously and will be conducting a full investigation." "An investigation?" Henderson repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, that's appropriate. But I'd like to suggest something additional." The captain looked wary but nodded for Henderson to continue. "I'd like to turn this incident into an opportunity," Henderson said, raising his voice slightly so the gathered crowd could hear as well. "An opportunity for growth, for education, and for real change in how our community and our police force interact." He turned to address the neighbors directly. "Most of you have known me for years. You've seen me at neighborhood association meetings, at community events, working in my yard on weekends. Some of you have been to my home for dinner. But I wonder how many of you knew that this," he gestured to the scene around them, "is part of my experience too. Part of the experience of many Black Americans, regardless of their address, their education, or their position." The neighbors shifted uncomfortably, many avoiding eye contact. Henderson continued, his voice steady. "I don't share this to make anyone feel guilty or defensive. I share it because awareness is the first step toward change, and I believe we, all of us here, have a unique opportunity to create meaningful change starting right now in our own community." He turned back to Captain Reeves. "I'm proposing a series of community dialogues, not press conferences, not formal hearings, but honest conversations between your officers and the citizens they serve. I'd be willing to help organize and facilitate these discussions." Reeves looked surprised but intrigued. "That's an unusual approach, Judge." "Sometimes unusual approaches are exactly what we need," Henderson replied. "Standard procedures haven't solved this problem in decades. Perhaps it's time to try something new." Mitchell, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "I'd participate, sir." When everyone turned to look at him, he straightened his shoulders. "If Judge Henderson is willing to turn this into a learning opportunity instead of a complaint, the least I can do is show up and listen." Henderson studied the officer's face, looking for signs of insincerity or mere self-preservation. What he saw instead was the beginning of something that might, with care and attention, grow into genuine understanding. "Thank you, Officer Mitchell," he said quietly. That's a good start. As the evening deepened around them, the gathered crowd began to disperse slowly, taking with them not just footage of an incident but the seeds of a conversation that would spread far beyond Pine Ridge Avenue. By morning, what had happened here would be shared across social media platforms, discussed in living rooms and break rooms, examined on news programs and in editorial columns. But for now, in this moment, something small but significant had shifted. A door had been opened, just a crack, allowing light to shine on truths too often left in shadow. And Robert Henderson, who had walked through many such doors in his 53 years, knew that sometimes that was enough to begin changing the world. By 10 o'clock the next morning, Judge Robert Henderson's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. The first call had come at 5:43 a.m., a reporter from the local news station who had somehow gotten his personal number. Henderson had let it go to voicemail. The next dozen calls had received the same treatment. The video had gone viral overnight. The teenager who had recorded the entire encounter, 15-year-old Tyler Washington, had posted it to his social media accounts before going to bed. By morning, it had been viewed over 2 million times and was being picked up by national news outlets. Henderson sat in his kitchen, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him as he scrolled through the headlines on his tablet. Federal judge racially profiled in his own neighborhood. Officer accuses black federal judge of stealing his own car. Pine Ridge incident highlights ongoing issues of racial profiling in policing. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Catherine Williams. He answered on the second ring. It's everywhere, Robert, she said without preamble. CNN just ran a segment. They're calling it driving while black. Even federal judges aren't immune. Henderson sighed. I was afraid of that. How bad is it? For the department? Pretty bad. For Mitchell? Catastrophic, potentially. They've already placed him on administrative leave pending a full investigation. The mayor has called a press conference for noon. Henderson pinched the bridge of his nose. This wasn't what he had wanted. Yes, accountability was necessary, but a media circus would only entrench people in their existing positions, creating more heat than light. What about you? Catherine asked when he didn't respond immediately. How are you holding up? I've had better mornings, Henderson admitted. My phone hasn't stopped ringing. Someone from Good Morning America called my mother in Florida to try to get a comment. Your mother?
How did they even find her?
That's a very good question, Henderson said grimly. After hanging up with Catherine, Henderson reluctantly checked his email. Amid the flood of interview requests and messages of support was an official communication from Police Chief Richard Bennett, requesting a meeting at Henderson's earliest convenience. Henderson was about to reply when his doorbell rang. He approached cautiously and peered through the peephole. Standing on his front porch, looking uncomfortable in civilian clothes, was Officer Lisa Chen. He opened the door, surprised. Officer Chen, I didn't expect to see you here. Chen shifted her weight nervously. Judge Henderson, I'm sorry to bother you at home. I'm not here officially, I'm off duty. I felt like I needed to talk to you. Henderson considered her for a moment, then stepped back. Come in, would you like some coffee? No, thank you, Chen said, following him into the house. I won't stay long. I know you must be dealing with a lot right now. They sat in Henderson's living room, sunlight streaming through the large windows that overlooked his carefully tended garden. I wanted to apologize, Chen began, not just for yesterday, but for not doing more to stop it. I knew what was happening wasn't right, but I didn't step in decisively enough. Henderson studied her face, seeing genuine remorse rather than just career preservation. You did try to de-escalate, he acknowledged. That counts for something. Not enough, Chen said firmly. I've been on the force for 3 years and I've seen this pattern before. Not just with Mitchell, but with others too. Sometimes I've spoken up, but often... She trailed off, looking down at her hands. Often it's easier not to, Henderson finished for her. To go along, to not make waves. Chen nodded, meeting his eyes again. The thing is, Judge Henderson, Mitchell isn't a bad person. At least I don't think he is. He's not one of those officers who talks about cleaning up the streets or uses slurs in the locker room. He has these blind spots, huge ones, and he doesn't see them. Many people have blind spots, Officer Chen. The problem comes when those blind spots are armed with a badge and a gun. Chen winced, but nodded. Yes, sir. That's why I wanted to talk to you. I heard about your idea for community dialogues. I want to help. I think there are others in the department who would too. Officers who want things to be better but don't know how to make that happen. Henderson felt a small spark of hope. This was exactly the kind of bridge building he had envisioned. Individual connections that could, with time and effort, lead to systemic change. I appreciate that, he said, and I'll take all the help I can get. This isn't going to be easy, especially now that the media has hold of the story. Have you seen the comments? Chen asked hesitantly. Online, I mean. Henderson shook his head. I've avoided them so far. Nothing good ever comes from reading internet comments. It's divided, Chen said carefully. A lot of support for you, especially as more people learn about your background and your work on the bench. But there's also a contingent defending Mitchell, saying he was just doing his job, that anyone would be suspicious of an expensive car in that neighborhood if the driver didn't look like they belonged. Henderson wasn't surprised. He'd been a judge long enough to know that people often saw exactly what they expected to see, fitting new information into their existing worldview, rather than adjusting their perspective. And what about within the department? He asked. What's the reaction there? Chen hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with betraying the unofficial sentiments of her colleagues. Henderson raised a hand. You don't have to name names or share anything that would put you in an awkward position. I'm just trying to understand the landscape we're dealing with. It's mixed, Chen finally said. Some officers think Mitchell screwed up big time and is getting what he deserves. Others think he's being thrown under the bus for something any of them might have done. And there's a lot of concern about what this means for the department as a whole, especially if there's a lawsuit. Henderson nodded thoughtfully. I haven't decided whether to pursue legal action, he admitted. Part of me feels I should, if only to create a formal record of what happened. But another part of me wonders if that would just make everything more adversarial, less conducive to actual change. Chen seemed relieved by his uncertainty. For what it's worth, Judge, I think your idea about dialogue might do more good in the long run than a lawsuit. But I understand if you feel you need to pursue both paths. Their conversation was interrupted by Henderson's phone ringing again. He glanced at the screen and sighed. The mayor, he explained. I should take this. Chen stood quickly. Of course. I'll let myself out. Thank you for seeing me, Judge Henderson. Thank you for coming, Officer Chen, and for your honesty. I'll be in touch about those community dialogues. After Chen left, Henderson's day became a whirlwind of calls and decisions. The mayor wanted him at the press conference. The police chief wanted a private meeting first. His colleagues on the bench were concerned about how this might affect his current cases, particularly any involving law enforcement. And reporters were still trying every channel they could find to reach him for comment. By late afternoon, Henderson found himself in a conference room at City Hall, surrounded by concerned faces. Mayor Patricia Reynolds, Police Chief Bennett, City Attorney Howard Green, and Catherine Williams, who had insisted on being present as both his colleague and his friend. The public response has been significant, Mayor Reynolds was saying, her fingers steepled in front of her. We need to get ahead of this, Judge Henderson. The department is already facing calls for an independent investigation, and there are protesters gathering outside police headquarters. Protesters? Henderson asked, alarmed. It's been less than 24 hours. The video has over 10 million views now, Green explained. It's not just local anymore. National civil rights organizations are involved. There's talk of making this a test case. Henderson frowned. A test case for what exactly? For challenging the reasonable suspicion standard in traffic stops, Catherine explained. Your position, the clear evidence of profiling, the video documentation, it creates a perfect storm for a case that could potentially reach the Supreme Court. The weight of this settled on Henderson's shoulders. What had begun as a simple drive home from work was rapidly becoming something that could shape legal precedent for decades to come. That's not what I want, he said finally. Chief Bennett looked surprised. You don't want to pursue a case against the department? I want accountability, Henderson clarified. I want change, but I'm not convinced that years of litigation is the most direct path to either of those things. The officer has been placed on administrative leave, Bennett offered. The internal investigation has already begun, and given the evidence, disciplinary action is virtually certain. Henderson leaned forward. And then what? Mitchell gets fired or suspended, becomes a cautionary tale for other officers and everything goes back to business as usual? How does that help the next person who gets pulled over for a broken taillight that isn't broken? The room fell silent. What are you suggesting instead? Mayor Reynolds asked finally. I still believe in the community dialogue approach I mentioned yesterday, Henderson said, but I think we need to go further. I'm proposing a comprehensive review of traffic stop policies and practices, with a focus on identifying and eliminating opportunities for bias to influence officer decisions. That would be unprecedented, Chief Bennett said, looking uncomfortable. Yes, it would, Henderson agreed, and it would send a powerful message that this city is committed to doing more than just damage control, that you're genuinely interested in addressing the root causes of incidents like this. The police union will fight it, Green warned. They'll see it as an attack on officer discretion. Then we'll need to make it clear that this isn't about tying officers' hands, Henderson countered. It's about ensuring that discretion is exercised fairly and consistently across all demographics. It's about making sure that good policing isn't undermined by unchecked bias. Catherine was nodding slowly. It could work, especially with the current level of public attention. And Robert's involvement would give it credibility with communities that might otherwise be skeptical. Mayor Reynolds tapped her fingers thoughtfully on the table. I can see the potential benefits. A proactive approach might help rebuild trust and potentially head off a costly lawsuit. I'm not ruling out legal action, Henderson clarified, but I'm willing to put that on hold if I see genuine commitment to meaningful change. The meeting continued for another hour, hammering out details and addressing concerns. By the time they emerged, the framework of an agreement was taking shape, one that would require courage and commitment from all involved. But that offered a path forward that wasn't simply more of the same. As Henderson left City Hall, a small group of reporters spotted him and rushed over, cameras and microphones thrust forward. He had been avoiding the press all day, but now, with a plan beginning to take form, he paused. Judge Henderson, will you be filing a lawsuit against the police department? Do you believe Officer Mitchell should be fired? What message do you have for other Black Americans who face similar situations? Henderson held up a hand, waiting for the questions to subside. When they finally did, he spoke carefully, knowing his words would be replayed and analyzed in the coming days. What happened yesterday was unfortunately not an isolated incident, he began. It's part of a pattern that affects countless Americans every day. The difference is that most of those incidents aren't captured on video, and most of those citizens don't have the protection of a title or the platform that I have. He paused, making eye contact with the reporters. I intend to use that platform not just to seek accountability in my own case, but to work toward systemic changes that will protect everyone in our community. In the coming days, I'll be announcing a collaborative initiative between community members and law enforcement to address these issues directly and constructively. That's all I have to say for now. Thank you. As he walked away, Henderson knew that the hardest work was still ahead. Change wouldn't come easily or quickly. There would be resistance, setbacks, and moments of frustration. But for the first time since those patrol lights had flashed in his rearview mirror, he felt something like optimism. Sometimes it took a moment of crisis to create an opportunity for transformation. And Robert Henderson, who had spent his career seeking justice in a flawed system, was determined not to let this opportunity go to waste. 3 weeks after the incident, Pine Ridge Community Center hummed with nervous energy. Rows of chairs had been arranged to face a small stage, and nearly every seat was filled. On the left side sat mostly civilians, neighborhood residents, community activists, concerned citizens. On the right, a group of police officers in uniform, their faces a mixture of skepticism, discomfort, and cautious interest. Judge Robert Henderson stood at the podium, surveying the room. When he had proposed these community dialogues, he hadn't been sure anyone would show up. Now, looking at the packed room, he felt both encouraged and daunted by the task ahead. Good evening, he began, his deep voice carrying easily through the space. Thank you all for coming. I know many of you had other places you could be tonight, and I appreciate you choosing to be here instead. In the front row, Catherine Williams gave him an encouraging nod. Beside her sat Police Chief Bennett, who had surprised Henderson with his willingness to participate personally in these sessions. On Henderson's other side, Mayor Reynolds adjusted her microphone, preparing to speak after him. 3 weeks ago, Henderson continued, I was pulled over a few blocks from my home. What followed has been described, debated, and dissected extensively in the media and online. But tonight isn't about relitigating that incident. It's about moving forward together. He paused, making eye contact with various people around the room, including several officers. I've spent much of my professional life in courtrooms, where we operate under strict rules of evidence and procedure. Tonight is different. This isn't a trial. There are no opposing sides, no verdicts to be rendered. This is a conversation, one that might be uncomfortable at times, but that I believe is necessary. In the third row, Officer Mitchell shifted in his seat. After 2 weeks of administrative leave and a formal reprimand, he had been given the option to participate in this community initiative in lieu of a suspension. To many people's surprise, including Henderson's, he had agreed. Now, I'd like to turn things over to Mayor Reynolds, who will explain the format for tonight's discussion, Henderson said, stepping back from the podium. The mayor approached, her expression serious. Thank you, Judge Henderson. As many of you know, following the incident 3 weeks ago, the city has committed to a comprehensive review of our traffic stop policies. But policy changes on paper mean nothing if they're not accompanied by changes in understanding and perspective on all sides. She gestured to the diverse group assembled before her. That's why we're here. Tonight is the first of 6 planned community dialogues, each focusing on a different aspect of police-community relations. We'll hear personal experiences, professional insights, and practical suggestions. And most importantly, we'll listen to each other. As the mayor explained the ground rules for the discussion, Henderson found himself watching Mitchell. The officer sat stiffly in his chair, eyes fixed on the mayor, jaw tight. Henderson had spoken with him briefly before the session began, their first interaction since the traffic stop. Mitchell had been formal, guarded, but not hostile. He had thanked Henderson for going easy on him with the disciplinary recommendations. Henderson had corrected him gently. This wasn't about going easy. It was about finding a response that could create something constructive from a destructive incident. The first hour of the dialogue was tense but civil. Community members shared experiences of feeling targeted or unfairly treated by law enforcement. Officers spoke about the challenges and dangers of their jobs, the split-second decisions they often had to make. Then it was Mitchell's turn to speak. He approached the microphone slowly, his uniform crisp but his shoulders slightly hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. My name is Officer James Mitchell, he began, his voice quieter than usual. Most of you probably know who I am by now. A murmur ran through the audience. The teenager who had recorded the original incident, Tyler Washington, leaned forward in his seat watching intently. 3 weeks ago, I made a traffic stop that has since become well known, Mitchell continued. I've spent a lot of time thinking about that stop, why I made it, what assumptions led to my decisions that evening, and what I might have done differently. He paused, taking a deep breath. Henderson could see the struggle, playing out on his face, the desire to defend, himself warring with the recognition that something had been fundamentally wrong with his actions that day. I could stand here and talk about being tired at the end of a long shift, or about the statistics we're taught in training, about certain types of crimes in certain areas. I could list all the reasons that seemed to justify my suspicions at the time. Mitchell shook his head slowly. But the truth is simpler and harder to admit. I saw Judge Henderson, though I didn't know he was a judge then, and I made assumptions based on how he looked and what he was driving. I didn't consciously think, I'm going to stop this person because of his race. But when I examine my decisions honestly, I have to acknowledge that race played a role in my suspicion. The room had gone completely still. Even those who had been skeptical of Mitchell's presence were listening intently now. I'm not saying this to ask for sympathy or forgiveness, Mitchell continued. I'm saying it because it's the truth, and because recognizing it is the first step toward making sure I don't make the same mistake again. He looked directly at Henderson for the first time. I want to thank Judge Henderson for proposing this alternative to a harsher punishment. At first I thought he was just being merciful. Now I understand that this, facing the community, acknowledging my mistakes, and committing to do better, this is actually much harder than simply serving a suspension would have been. As Mitchell returned to his seat, the atmosphere in the room shifted subtly. The acknowledgement wasn't a magical solution to years of mistrust, but it was something many in the audience had never heard before, a public admission from an officer that bias had influenced his actions. Without excuses or deflection, the dialogue continued, gradually becoming more nuanced, more productive. Community members offered specific suggestions for improving interactions. Officers shared perspectives on changes that might make their jobs both safer and more equitable. The mayor and police chief took notes throughout, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly listening. By the time the session ended 2 hours later, something had changed in the room. Not everything, certainly. Deep-seated issues couldn't be resolved in a single evening, but something. A door had been opened. A conversation had begun. As people filtered out of the community center, Henderson found himself approached by Tyler Washington and his father. "Judge Henderson," Mr. Washington said, extending his hand, "I wanted to thank you for what you're doing here." When Tyler showed me that video he'd taken, my first instinct was anger. Pure anger. I wanted that officer fired at minimum. Henderson nodded understandingly. "That's a natural reaction. I felt some of that anger myself. But this," Mr. Washington gestured to the room, "this feels like something that might actually lead somewhere better in the long run. For everyone, including my son." Tyler, who had been quiet, finally spoke up. "Do you think Officer Mitchell meant what he said? About understanding what he did wrong?" Henderson considered the question carefully. "I think he's beginning to. Understanding our own biases is hard work. It doesn't happen overnight. But admitting them publicly like he did tonight, that's a significant step." As the Washingtons walked away, Henderson caught sight of Mitchell standing alone near the exit. After a moment's hesitation, he walked over to him. "Officer Mitchell." Mitchell straightened immediately. "Judge Henderson." "Thank you for what you said tonight," Henderson said simply. "I know that couldn't have been easy." Mitchell nodded, his expression a complex mixture of emotions. "It wasn't, but it was necessary." He hesitated, then added, "My sister called me after she saw the video online. She was disappointed in me." That hit harder than any official reprimand could have. Henderson understood. Sometimes it was those personal connections, the people whose good opinion mattered most to us, who could prompt the most profound self-examination. "Will you be at the next session?" Henderson asked. "Yes," Mitchell replied without hesitation. "I've signed up for all of them. And I'm working with Officer Chen to revise some of our training materials based on what I learned from my mistake." As they parted ways, Henderson felt a cautious optimism. One conversation wouldn't fix generations of mistrust. One officer acknowledging his bias wouldn't transform an entire system. But it was a beginning. Outside in the parking lot, Catherine was waiting for him, leaning against her car. "That went better than I expected," she said as he approached. "It did," Henderson agreed. "Though we have a long way to go." Always the realist, Catherine smiled. "But admit it. Seeing Mitchell stand up there and actually acknowledge his bias, that was something you didn't think would happen." Henderson nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. I wasn't sure he'd get there, at least not so soon. It gives me hope." "Hope is good," Catherine said. "We could all use more of that." As they looked back at the community center, people were still lingering outside in small groups, officers talking with residents, city officials engaged in conversations with community activists. The usual barriers were temporarily lowered, allowing for exchanges that might not have happened otherwise. The next morning, Henderson arrived at the courthouse early, as was his habit. As he walked to his chambers, he noticed several of his colleagues gathered around a computer screen. "Robert," one of them called. "Have you seen this?" Henderson approached cautiously, expecting more coverage of last night's community dialogue. Instead, he found them watching a video of a traffic stop from a neighboring county. A young black woman had been pulled over, allegedly for a broken taillight, but instead of escalating the situation, the officer had approached respectfully, explained the reason for the stop, and actually shown her the light that needed fixing. When she explained she had just gotten the car from her brother and hadn't known about the light, he had given her information on where to get it fixed inexpensively, and sent her on her way with a warning. What made the video remarkable wasn't the interaction itself, which should have been routine, but what the officer said at the end. "After what happened with Judge Henderson in Pine Ridge, we're all trying to be more mindful about how we conduct traffic stops. Drive safely and get that light fixed when you can." Henderson's colleagues looked at him with varying expressions of respect and Curiosity, it's already making a difference, one of them said quietly. Henderson nodded, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. The incident that had left him feeling vulnerable and angry was now becoming a reference point for positive change. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was something real. As he continued to his chambers, Henderson thought about the long path ahead. The policy reviews were just beginning. The community dialogues would continue for months. The deeper work of addressing systemic biases would take years, perhaps generations. But for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that meaningful change was possible. Not because one officer had acknowledged his bias, or because one police department was revising its policies, but because people on all sides were finally willing to have the difficult conversations that had been avoided for too long. And sometimes, Henderson reflected as he settled at his desk, that's how justice begins, not with a dramatic verdict or a sweeping reform, but with people finding the courage to face uncomfortable truths and the wisdom to build something better together.